Retired teacher freezes up, seeing Benefactor, his student she once failed. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over Ruby Claire's modest living room as she sank into her favorite armchair, the invitation trembling in her hand. She had read the card twice already, but the bold letters at the top still felt surreal. Honoring excellence in education. Gala dinner, hosted by Mason James. Her breath caught each time her eyes landed on the name. It couldn't be the same Mason James, could it? Her mind raced as she traced the embossed edges of the card. Ruby had taught high school English for nearly 30 years, her reputation built on high standards and unflinching honesty. She remembered Mason clearly. He had been a bright but troubled student who tried to cheat his way through her class during his senior year. The memory of that confrontation resurfaced vividly. His defiant expression, her firm voice as she laid out the consequences, and his furious words before storming out of the classroom. "You'll regret this," he had spat, his eyes burning with anger. The school's administration had backed her decision to fail him, but it had left a bitter taste in her mouth. Mason had been one of the most intelligent students she had taught, but he lacked discipline and seemed unwilling to channel his potential. She had wondered, over the years, if she could have handled it differently, found another way to guide him. Ruby set the invitation on the small side table beside her and stared out the window. Her retirement had been peaceful but uneventful. She filled her days with volunteer work, gardening, and the occasional gathering with her former colleagues. When the news broke about the scholarship program transforming their local schools, she had felt a sense of hope for the future. It was a lifeline for underprivileged students, providing resources and opportunities that had been scarce during her teaching years. But now, knowing Mason James was behind it, Ruby felt an unease creeping in. The card included a personal note at the bottom. "Ms. Claire, your influence shaped more of my life than you realize. I would be honored if you would attend." Ruby leaned back, the note twisting her emotions into a knot. Was this an olive branch? A veiled jab? She couldn't tell. The thought of facing Mason after all these years sent her heart racing, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she owed him something. If not an apology, then at least an acknowledgement of her own doubts about the past. As the day turned to evening, Ruby made her decision. She would attend the gala. She needed answers, and perhaps Mason did too. The week leading up to the event passed in a blur of preparation and nerves. Ruby chose a simple but elegant dress, ironed out the creases, and borrowed a pearl necklace from her neighbor, Lily May. On the night of the gala, as she adjusted her earrings in the mirror, she noticed her hands trembling. Taking a deep breath, she whispered to herself, "You can do this, Ruby." The event was held at an upscale hotel downtown, a far cry from the school gymnasium fundraisers she was accustomed to. As Ruby stepped out of the taxi, the grandeur of the venue took her by surprise. The entrance was adorned with twinkling lights, and a red carpet led to double doors manned by staff in tuxedos. Guests mingled in clusters outside, their laughter and chatter filling the air. Ruby hesitated at the edge of the crowd, clutching her small handbag. She hadn't attended an event this formal in years, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on her. Before she could talk herself out of it, a cheerful voice called her name. "Miss Claire, you made it!" Ruby turned to see a young woman approaching, her bright smile instantly disarming. She introduced herself as Sophia Blake, one of the event coordinators. "Mr. James will be so pleased to see you," Sophia said warmly, leading Ruby toward the entrance. Inside, the ballroom was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the elegantly decorated tables. A live jazz band played softly in the corner, and waitstaff circulated with trays of champagne flutes. Ruby felt out of place amid the opulence, but Sophia's presence was comforting as she guided her to a table near the stage. The program began shortly after, with speeches from educators, students, and community leaders who praised the scholarship initiative. As the evening unfolded, Ruby couldn't help but feel a growing sense of admiration for the impact the program was having. The students who spoke seemed genuinely transformed, their lives changed by the opportunities they had been given. Then, Mason James took the stage. Ruby's breath caught as she saw him for the first time in decades. He was older, of course, but his confident stride and sharp features were unmistakable. He wore a tailored suit, his demeanor polished and commanding. When he smiled at the audience, it was genuine but reserved, a hint of something deeper beneath the surface. "Good evening," Mason began, his voice smooth and steady. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate something very dear to me, the power of education." As he spoke about the program's mission and its successes, Ruby felt a pang of recognition. This was the Mason she had seen glimpses of all those years ago, the one brimming with potential, but his words carried a weight that hinted at a personal journey she didn't yet understand. "And now," Mason continued, his gaze sweeping the room, "I'd like to take a moment to honor someone who made a profound impact on my life, even if I didn't realize it at the time." Ruby's heart stopped as his eyes locked on hers. "Ms. Ruby Clare," Mason said, his voice softening. "You taught me lessons far beyond the classroom, lessons that shaped the person I am today. Please join me on stage." The room erupted in applause as all eyes turned to her. Ruby froze, her mind racing. This was the moment she had dreaded, and yet she felt an inexplicable pull to face it. She gripped the edges of her chair, steadying herself before rising to her feet. Ruby felt every step toward the stage as if she were climbing a mountain. The applause filled her ears, but her focus was on Mason, whose calm smile and steady gaze seemed to be waiting for something. Perhaps her reaction, or perhaps a shared acknowledgement of the past. Her pulse quickened as she approached him, her thoughts swirling with uncertainty and old memories. Mason extended a hand to help her up the steps, his grip firm but respectful. "It's so good to see you, Miss Clare," he said softly, his tone warm, but with an edge of something she couldn't quite place. Ruby nodded, her voice caught somewhere between her mind and throat. She wasn't ready to speak yet, not under the bright lights and the gaze of 100 strangers. Mason turned back to the audience, his smile widening as he gestured toward her. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce you to someone who has influenced my life in ways I couldn't comprehend when I was younger. Ms. Clare was my high school English teacher, and though we had, let's say, a challenging relationship back then, her lessons stayed with me long after graduation." The crowd chuckled politely, and Ruby's stomach twisted. She couldn't tell if his words were genuine or laced with subtle irony. She forced herself to stand tall, unwilling to show the internal storm raging within her. Mason continued, his tone growing more serious. "When I was a senior, I made a mistake. A big one. I thought I could take shortcuts, avoid putting in the work and still succeed. Ms. Clare didn't let me. She held me accountable, even when it cost me. At the time, I resented her for it. I thought she had ruined my future, Ruby's breath caught. This was the moment she had feared. The moment he would lay bare her decision to fail him for cheating. But Mason surprised her by smiling, a genuine expression that softened the weight of his words. But now, looking back, I realized she didn't ruin anything. She saved me. That failure was the wake-up call I needed. It forced me to reevaluate my choices, to take responsibility for my actions. And for that, Miss Claire, I owe you my deepest thanks. The room broke into applause again, but Ruby felt frozen in place. Mason turned to her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to gauge her reaction. She managed a small smile, though her thoughts were spinning. Was this truly gratitude? Or was there something else behind his words? Mason handed her the microphone, and the applause quieted. Would you like to say a few words, Miss Claire? Ruby hesitated, gripping the microphone tightly. She scanned the crowd, the faces blurring together under the bright lights. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke. Thank you, Mason, she began, her voice steady but measured. I'm honored to be here tonight. Hearing your story and seeing the impact you've had on this community is inspiring. I always believed in your potential, even when you didn't see it yourself. The audience clapped again, but Ruby barely noticed. She handed the microphone back to Mason, her heart racing as she stepped away from the spotlight. He guided her off stage, his hand lightly on her elbow. As soon as they were out of the audience's view, Mason's demeanor shifted. The polite smile remained, but his eyes carried a sharp intensity that caught Ruby off guard. Thank you for coming tonight, he said, his voice low. It means a lot to me. Ruby nodded, her unease growing. You've done incredible work with this program. It's clear you've come a long way. Mason's smile faltered slightly. I have, but I didn't invite you here just to celebrate my success. Ruby's chest tightened. Then why did you invite me? Mason hesitated, glancing toward the bustling crowd in the ballroom before meeting her gaze again. Because I wanted you to see what that moment in high school meant to me. Failing your class felt like the end of the world back then. I blamed you for everything. My parents' disappointment, my lost scholarship opportunities, my own shame. But over time, I realized you were right. I needed that lesson. Ruby frowned, sensing there was more. And yet, you still seem conflicted. Mason let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. Conflicted is one word for it. I have spent years trying to prove to myself, and maybe to you, that I wasn't the failure you thought I was. I never thought you were a failure, Ruby said, her voice firm. I thought you were someone who needed guidance, someone who needed to learn that integrity matters more than shortcuts. Mason's gaze hardened slightly, his smile disappearing. And yet, the way you handled it nearly broke me. Did you ever wonder if there was another way? If you could have helped me without tearing me down? The words hit Ruby like a punch to the chest. She opened her mouth to respond, but found herself speechless. The truth was, she had wondered. For years, she had replayed that decision in her mind, questioning whether she could have done more to support Mason instead of simply enforcing the rules. Mason's expression softened, as if sensing her internal struggle. I'm not here to blame you, Miss Claire. I've made peace with the past, but I wanted you to know how much it shaped me. Not just the pain, but the lessons. And I wanted to show you that even the hardest moments can lead to something meaningful. Ruby nodded slowly, her emotions a tangled web of guilt, pride, and gratitude. Thank you for sharing that, Mason. It means more than you know. They stood in silence for a moment, the noise of the gala fading into the background. Ruby felt a weight lift from her shoulders, though the questions lingering in her mind remained. Had she truly done the right thing all those years ago? Or had Mason's success come despite her actions, rather than because of them? Before she could dwell further, Mason extended a hand. Come back to the table. There are people who would love to meet you. Ruby hesitated, then took his hand. As they walked back into the ballroom, she realized that the evening wasn't just about revisiting the past. It was about finding a way to move forward, for both of them. Mason led Ruby back into the crowded ballroom, their steps measured and deliberate. The atmosphere buzzed with lively conversation and clinking glasses, but Ruby felt like an outsider, still processing their exchange backstage. She glanced at Mason, who now wore his polished smile again, expertly masking the vulnerability he had just shown. They reached a table near the front of the room where several guests greeted Mason with warm enthusiasm. "This is Ms. Ruby Clare," Mason announced, his voice carrying a tone of respect. "My high school English teacher and a woman who profoundly shaped my life." The table erupted in polite applause and murmurs of admiration. Ruby forced a smile, nodding at the strangers, though the attention made her uneasy. A woman sitting nearby, introduced as Sophia Blake, leaned forward. "Ms. Clare, you must be so proud of Mason. The way he talks about you, it's clear you made a big impact." Ruby's smile tightened, unsure how to respond. "It's been incredible to see all he's accomplished." Another guest, a sharply dressed man named Elijah Cole, chimed in. "Mason's work with the scholarship program is revolutionary. Did you see his pitch for integrating mentorship with AI tutoring systems? It's going to change education." Ruby's eyebrows lifted slightly. She hadn't known the specifics of Mason's work, only the broad strokes mentioned in articles and the event's promotional materials. "I haven't had the chance to learn much about the technical side," she admitted. Mason smiled at her, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd be happy to explain it to you later, Ms. Clare. You might find it interesting how the program aligns with some of the principles you taught us back in the day." Ruby wasn't sure if his words were sincere or a subtle jab, but she nodded nonetheless. Mason turned his attention back to the table, engaging the other guests with effortless charm. As the conversation flowed around her, Ruby felt a growing sense of displacement. It was as though she were observing a world she didn't quite belong to, a world Mason had built without her, despite her, perhaps even in defiance of her. The thought gnawed at her as the evening wore on. She listened as Mason and his colleagues discussed innovative strategies for expanding the scholarship program, their enthusiasm palpable. Ruby couldn't help but feel a flicker of pride, but it was accompanied by a deep sense of doubt. How much of this success was born from the pain she had inadvertently caused? And did that make her responsible for it? In some small way. When the meal was over and the speeches resumed, Ruby found herself retreating into her thoughts. The gala was undeniably impressive, a testament to Mason's vision and determination. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension between them that remained unresolved. Mason had thanked her publicly, even praised her, but his private words had revealed a more complicated truth. As the event drew to a close, Mason approached her again, his expression warm but careful. "Would you like to take a walk, Ms. Clare?" "Sure, there's a garden terrace just outside. It's quieter." Ruby hesitated, but nodded. "That sounds nice." They stepped out onto the terrace, leaving the noise and bright lights behind. The garden was beautifully lit, with lanterns hanging from the trees and a soft breeze rustling the leaves. Mason gestured to a bench near a small fountain, and they sat side by side, the sound of trickling water filling the silence. Mason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. I meant what I said earlier about how much your class meant to me, even if I didn't realize it at the time. Ruby looked at him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I appreciate that, Mason, but I also know I didn't handle everything perfectly. You were one of the brightest students I ever taught. I should have found a way to help you without making you feel so lost. Mason's jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly. I was angry at you for a long time. Failing your class felt like a betrayal, like you didn't believe in me. But as I got older, I realized that wasn't the case. You believed in the rules, in what you thought was right. I didn't know how to handle that back then. Ruby's chest ached at his words. You're right. I believed in the rules, sometimes too much. I thought I was teaching integrity, but I didn't see the bigger picture. I'm sorry for the pain I caused you, Mason. I truly am. Mason turned to her, his expression softening. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. He paused, his gaze drifting to the fountain. But you know, part of me still wonders what might have happened if you'd handled things differently. Would I have ended up here? Would I have learned the same lessons? Ruby followed his gaze, the question hanging in the air. We can't rewrite the past, Mason. All we can do is learn from it and try to do better moving forward. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. That's what this program is about for me. Giving students the tools and guidance I didn't have. Making sure they don't feel as lost as I did. Ruby's eyes stung with unshed tears. You've turned your pain into something extraordinary. That takes strength, Mason. More than most people have. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past slowly lifting between them. For the first time, Ruby felt a sense of closure, not just for Mason, but for herself. She had spent years questioning her decisions, carrying the guilt of what might have been. Now, she saw the full picture, complicated but not irredeemable. Mason stood, extending a hand to help her up. Come on, they'll wonder where we've gone. Ruby took his hand, smiling as she rose. Thank you for inviting me tonight, Mason. It means more than you know. He smiled back, the tension between them easing into something resembling peace. Thank you for coming. It wouldn't have been the same without you. They walked back into the ballroom together, the noise and light welcoming them like a new chapter beginning. The following morning, Ruby sat by her kitchen window, the warm sunlight casting a golden hue over her modest apartment. She sipped her coffee slowly, her thoughts lingering on the previous night. Mason's words played on a loop in her mind, and the emotions they stirred were difficult to untangle. There had been gratitude, yes, but also pain, and the weight of unresolved questions about her own actions. She picked up her phone and opened the email app, finding a message from Sophia Blake, one of Mason's colleagues at the gala. It was a follow-up thanking Ruby for attending and including a link to a recording of Mason's speech. At the bottom, Sophia had added, Mason mentioned you might be interested in visiting one of the scholarship sites. Let us know if you'd like to schedule a tour. Ruby stared at the email, her finger hovering over the screen. Part of her wanted to decline. She had already seen the impact of Mason's work at the gala. But another part of her, one she couldn't ignore, felt compelled to see the program up close. She needed to understand its full scope, to see for herself what Mason had built from the ashes of his younger self. After a moment's hesitation, she replied, agreeing to a visit later in the week. The decision filled her with a mix of nervousness and anticipation, but she pushed those feelings aside. She had taken the first step toward closure with Mason. This was the next. The scholarship site was housed in a repurposed community center in the heart of the city, surrounded by bustling streets and vibrant murals that reflected the diversity of the neighborhood. When Ruby arrived, Sophia was there to greet her, her energy as warm and infectious as it had been at the gala. "I'm so glad you came, Ms. Clare," Sophia said, leading Ruby through the center's front doors. "This place has become a second home for a lot of these kids." Inside, the center buzzed with activity. Students worked at long tables, laptops open, their faces focused and determined. A group gathered around a whiteboard where a mentor guided them through a math problem. Another cluster of students sat in a corner, engaged in animated discussions about college applications. The air was alive with ambition and collaboration. Sophia gestured to the room. "This is the heart of the program. We pair students with mentors and use AI-assisted tutoring to give them personalized support. The goal is to level the playing field for kids who've faced systemic barriers to success." Ruby nodded, her gaze sweeping over the room. "It's incredible," she said softly. "I've never seen anything like it." Sophia smiled. "Mason's vision is something else, isn't it? He wanted to create a space where no one feels left behind, no matter their circumstances." The mention of Mason brought Ruby's emotions to the surface again, but she kept them in check. "And it seems to be working." "It is," Sophia agreed. "But you should hear it from the students themselves. Let me introduce you to a few." Sophia led Ruby to a group of teens working on college essays. They introduced themselves with shy smiles, their voices filled with both nervousness and pride as they shared their stories. One girl, Isabella Quinn, spoke about how the program had helped her after her father lost his job and her grades began to slip. Another, Lucas Dean, credited the mentorship program with keeping him on track when he felt overwhelmed by the pressure of balancing school and a part-time job. Ruby listened intently, her heart swelling with admiration for these students and the resilience they displayed. It was clear that Mason's program was more than just a scholarship fund. It was a lifeline, a bridge to a future many of these kids had once thought unattainable. As the tour continued, Ruby found herself growing more and more impressed. The center's resources were state-of-the-art, but its true strength lay in the sense of community it fostered. The mentors and staff treated the students with genuine care and respect, creating an environment where they could thrive. When the tour ended, Sophia led Ruby to a small office where Mason was waiting. He stood as they entered, his expression warm but curious. "Ms. Clare," he said, gesturing to a chair. "How was the tour?" Ruby sat down, meeting his gaze. "It was remarkable, Mason. I'm amazed by what you've built here." Mason leaned back in his chair, his smile faint. "It's not just me. There's a whole team behind this, people like Sophia who make it all possible." Ruby nodded. "Even so, you were the catalyst. You took an idea and turned it into something tangible, something life-changing." For a moment, Mason looked almost uncomfortable with the praise. "I guess you could say I had a lot of motivation," he said quietly. The room fell silent, the weight of their shared history filling the space. Ruby cleared her throat, her voice steady but thoughtful. "Mason, I've been thinking a lot about what you said last night, about how my decisions affected you." Mason looked at her, his expression unreadable. "And I still believe I made the right choice in holding you accountable," Ruby said. "But I also know I could have handled it better. I see now that it wasn't just about following the rules. It was about understanding the person in front of me, what they needed to grow." Mason nodded slowly. "You did what you thought was best at the time. I can see that now. And in a strange way, I'm grateful for it. But it doesn't erase the hurt." "No, it doesn't," Ruby admitted. "And for that, I'm sorry." Mason's eyes softened and he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I think we've both learned a lot from this, haven't we?" Ruby smiled faintly. "I suppose we have." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, before Mason straightened. "I'm glad you came today. Seeing you here, hearing your thoughts, it means a lot." Ruby stood, extending a hand. "Thank you for inviting me. This program is extraordinary, and so are you, Mason." He shook her hand, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. "I think we're both extraordinary in our own ways." As Ruby left the center, the sunlight warming her face, she felt lighter than she had in years. The past wasn't something she could change, but it was something she could learn from. And as she walked away, she knew that both she and Mason had taken a significant step toward healing. Together, Ruby sat at her kitchen table the next morning, her cup of coffee cooling in front of her as she stared out the window. The events of the previous day felt surreal, as if she were caught in a dream she couldn't quite shake. The emotions she had experienced, the guilt, the pride, the confusion, swirled together in her mind. But one thing stood out: the undeniable sense of closure she had finally achieved with Mason. When she had agreed to meet him at the scholarship center, she hadn't expected to feel so at peace. She had anticipated confrontation, perhaps anger, maybe even resentment. But instead, what had transpired was understanding. For the first time in years, Ruby felt like she had reconciled not just with Mason, but with herself. She had always believed in the value of teaching, the importance of instilling discipline and integrity in her students. But seeing Mason now, a successful man who had made something meaningful of his life, despite all the obstacles and mistakes, forced her to reckon with the question she had avoided for so long. Had she been too rigid, too uncompromising in her pursuit of fairness? Ruby had spent countless nights lying awake, wondering what she could have done differently. Mason's confrontation at the gala, his revelations about how her actions had shaped him, had torn down the walls she had built around herself. His success and his forgiveness were a reminder that there was more than one way to be a teacher. Sometimes, the lesson wasn't in the grade you gave or the rule you enforced, but in the quiet, unseen ways you impacted a life. The sound of her phone vibrating on the table startled Ruby from her thoughts. She picked it up, expecting another message from Mason or Sophia, but instead, it was a text from her brother, Owen. "I heard from the school board," the message began. "They want to honor your contributions at the upcoming ceremony. They've asked me to help arrange everything." Ruby stared at the message, feeling a twinge of both pride and discomfort. Her career had been fulfilling, but it had always been about the students, never about the recognition. The thought of being in the spotlight again, after so many years in the quiet shadows of her retirement, was daunting. Yet, deep down, she knew it was a chance to fully acknowledge the road she had traveled, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned. She set the phone down and closed her eyes, letting the quiet moment settle in. For the first time in years, she realized that the legacy she had built wasn't just about teaching. It was about how she had grown from the experience. It was the culmination of all her doubts, fears, and triumphs, shaped into something she could finally embrace. And perhaps, just perhaps, the ceremony would be the final step in that journey. Ruby spent the next few days preparing for the ceremony, sorting through old lesson plans, award certificates, and student letters she had collected over the years. It was an emotional task, one that forced her to reflect on the highs and lows of her teaching career. She found herself reminiscing about the students she had helped, the ones who had come to her for advice, the ones who had left her classroom with more than just knowledge. They had left with a piece of her heart. As the ceremony day approached, Ruby felt a strange mix of anticipation and reluctance. She had agreed to speak at the event, but she wasn't sure what she would say. What words could possibly encapsulate a lifetime of teaching, of learning, of struggling to balance the desire for fairness with the need for compassion? On the day of the ceremony, Ruby donned a navy blue dress she had worn to many school events over the years. She made her way to the venue, a local auditorium that had been transformed for the occasion. When she arrived, she was greeted by familiar faces, former colleagues, students, and even some parents who had once trusted her with their children's education. Each greeting was met with warm smiles, but Ruby couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. She was no longer the teacher. She was the one being celebrated. As the ceremony began, Ruby sat in the front row, her hands resting nervously in her lap. The lights dimmed, and a representative from the school board took the stage, offering kind words about the impact Ruby had made over the years. Her heart swelled as they listed the accomplishments of her students, the ones who had gone on to become doctors, teachers, and entrepreneurs. But there was a familiar twinge of discomfort, a feeling she had always had when attention was on her. Finally, it was her turn to speak. Ruby stood and walked to the podium, her heart pounding in her chest. The crowd fell silent, and she gazed out at the sea of faces, each one carrying its own story, its own memory of the classroom. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I'm truly humbled by this honor. I spent 30 years teaching in this school, and in all that time, I never thought about awards or recognition. What mattered most to me was the students, their successes, their struggles, their growth. They were my reward." Ruby paused, collecting her thoughts. "But what I've come to realize, especially in the last few weeks, is that teaching is a journey that continues even after the classroom doors close. It's a journey of learning, not just for the students, but for us, the teachers. We make mistakes, we fail, we doubt ourselves, but it's how we rise from those moments that defines us. And as much as I've taught, I've learned just as much." She glanced down at the podium, her hands trembling slightly. "I've made mistakes. I've failed students, and I've failed myself. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this. We don't have to be perfect to make a difference. We just have to show up every day and try." The words felt heavier than she had anticipated, but they came from a place of honesty and reflection. She wasn't perfect, but she had given everything she had to the job, and in return, she had been given something far more valuable: wisdom, understanding, and the courage to face her mistakes head on. The audience was silent for a moment, and then, unexpectedly, they began to applaud. Ruby's heart swelled as she stood there, realizing that this wasn't just an applause for her. It was an acknowledgement of the journey, the lessons, and the imperfections that had shaped them all. After the ceremony, Ruby made her way through the crowd, exchanging hugs and words of thanks with colleagues and students. But as the crowd began to thin out, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Turning, she came face to face with Mason. "You did great," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I'm really proud of you, Ruby." Ruby smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't expected. "Thank you, Mason. Your program, everything you've done, it's incredible." Mason hesitated before speaking again. "I think we both learned a lot from the past," he said quietly. "And I'm glad we could finally talk about it." Ruby nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. "Me too. And I think we're both stronger for it." As Mason walked away, Ruby stood for a moment, watching him. She realized that, in the end, it wasn't about the mistakes or the regrets. It was about growth, about facing the past with honesty and moving forward with grace. The ceremony, the words, the applause, they were all part of a bigger picture. A picture that was still being painted, one lesson at a time. Ruby stood by the door of the auditorium, her heart still racing from the ceremony. The air around her felt lighter, the weight of the past slowly lifting as she reflected on the events of the evening. She had spoken honestly. She had acknowledged her own faults, and in doing so, she felt a deep sense of liberation. The applause had felt overwhelming at first, but it had also been a release, a recognition that she had made an impact on her students' lives, even if it had been imperfect at times. The crowd, the students, the teachers, everyone had applauded not just her accomplishments, but her honesty in admitting that there was room for growth. As Ruby made her way to the parking lot, her thoughts drifted to Mason. The conversation they had had backstage, the shared understanding that had taken root between them, seemed like a small but significant turning point. She had long carried the burden of guilt for failing him all those years ago, but now, seeing the man he had become, she felt a strange peace. Mason's success wasn't just about the program he had built. It was about his journey, one that she had unintentionally been a part of. Ruby realized that their past wasn't about blame or resentment. It was about the lessons learned, the paths they had both taken to get here. She couldn't undo what had happened, but they had both made the conscious choice to move forward, to heal. As she slid into her car and drove home, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Ruby couldn't help but smile. For the first time in years, she felt a true sense of purpose, not just in what she had taught, but in the ways she had grown. The work at the community center, the students' stories, and Mason's forgiveness, it all came together as a reminder that teaching was never a one-way street. She had been their teacher, but they had taught her just as much. The next morning, Ruby sat at her kitchen table, her coffee still warm in front of her, but her mind was already moving toward the future. She had agreed to visit the scholarship center again, this time to meet with the students personally. Her role, she now understood, didn't end with the ceremony. It had only just begun. There was work to do, not just to teach, but to inspire, to pass on what she had learned about second chances, about resilience, and about the power of understanding. She pulled up a document on her laptop. Notes for a new lesson plan she had started drafting. It wasn't for a classroom full of teenagers, but rather a community of learners, eager to shape their own futures. She was no longer just a teacher. She was part of a movement, one that transcended the walls of a traditional classroom. The lessons, the ones she had struggled to accept herself, were the ones that had ultimately defined her life. And she wasn't finished learning yet. Later that week, Ruby visited the Scholarship Center once more. She was greeted by Sophia and a few of the students who had spoken so highly of the program. Mason had invited her to meet with them directly, to understand the lives she had helped shape, even if indirectly. They were excited to meet her, and Ruby could see it in their eyes. The same spark she had seen in students all those years ago, before her own doubts had clouded her vision. Sophia showed her around the center, where Ruby was introduced to more students and mentors. Each one seemed eager to share their story, their journey, and the way the program had changed their lives. Some were from tough neighborhoods, others from single-parent households, but all of them had found a second chance at success through Mason's program. One girl, Ava Lee, stood out to Ruby. She had been a troubled student when she first joined the program, always skeptical of authority, and convinced that education was a waste of time. But now, as she spoke with Ruby, her words were filled with passion and conviction. "This program gave me hope when I didn't have any," Ava said, her eyes shining with determination. "And you were a part of that. It wasn't just Mason's work. It was all of you who made this possible." Ruby blinked back tears, feeling her heart swell with pride. She had doubted her impact as a teacher for so long, but standing here now, seeing the faces of the students who had found their way, she knew her legacy wasn't defined by any single decision or mistake. It was defined by these moments, the moments when her students found the courage to believe in themselves. After the tour, Mason pulled Ruby aside. "I've been meaning to thank you," he said, his tone sincere, "for everything you did. For me, for all of us. You may not have seen it back then, but you helped shape the foundation of what I'm trying to do now. And I want you to know that none of this would have been possible without your influence." Ruby smiled, her chest tight with emotion. "I didn't do anything, Mason. I just tried to help as best I could." "You did more than help," Mason replied. "You showed me that I could be better. You made me realize I could have a future beyond my mistakes. And now, I'm passing that on." Ruby nodded, feeling a sense of contentment settle over her. She had spent so long questioning her role in Mason's life, and now she understood that her impact had been more significant than she could have ever imagined. She wasn't the one who had shaped his path. That was something he had done on his own. But her decision, her discipline, had been the spark that lit the fire of change within him. And that was enough. As she left the center, Ruby felt lighter than she had in years. The weight of past regrets no longer burdened her. The healing process wasn't about erasing mistakes. It was about finding the courage to acknowledge them and use them to move forward. She had spent too long in the shadows, but now, for the first time in ages, Ruby was ready to step into the light. That evening, Ruby sat down to write in her journal, something she hadn't done in far too long. She reflected on the day's events, on the students she had met, and on the lessons she had learned. As she wrote, her thoughts turned to the future of these students, Mason's work, and her own role in shaping it all. She wrote one final entry, the words flowing freely. I've spent my life teaching students how to face challenges, how to persevere through difficulties. But today, I realize I've been teaching myself the same lessons. I can't undo the past, but I can use it to build a better future. I've learned that the best way to teach isn't by imposing rules. It's by showing people what they're capable of. And for the first time, I'm proud of the person I've become, even if it's taken me this long to see it. Ruby set the journal aside and gazed out the window once more. The sun had set, and the city stretched out before her, full of possibilities. She wasn't done yet. There was still so much more to learn, so much more to give. You've made it to the end. If you enjoyed this story, I am confident that you'll love the next one appearing on the screen now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and please give this video a like. I'll see you in the next one.